The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, turning the downtown streets into rivers of gray water that carried cigarette butts and fast food wrappers toward the storm drains. Marcus Riley pulled his tattered military jacket tighter around his shoulders and shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to find a dry spot under the narrow awning of the coffee shop. His cardboard sign, now soggy and barely readable, leaned against the brick wall beside him. The black ink had run slightly, but you could still make out the words, "Homeless Veteran." Anything helps, God bless. The morning rush hour crowd hurried past him like schools of fish, their umbrellas bobbing and weaving as they navigated the sidewalk. Most people avoided eye contact, their gazes fixed firmly on their phones or the path ahead. Marcus had grown used to being invisible. After 18 months on the streets, he understood that to most people, he was just part of the urban landscape, no different from a fire hydrant or a parking meter. But today was different. Today, a group of young businessmen had noticed him. They stood huddled under the large awning of the bank across the street, their expensive suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to Marcus's worn jeans and combat boots. One of them, a tall man with perfectly styled hair and a gold watch that caught the light, kept pointing in Marcus's direction and laughing. His companions joined in, their voices carrying across the street despite the sound of traffic and rain. "Look at that guy," the tall man said, his voice loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Probably spent his whole military career sitting behind a desk, and now he wants us to feel sorry for him." Another man, shorter but wearing an equally expensive suit, shook his head in disgust. "These fake veterans are everywhere now. They buy those jackets at thrift stores and think they can guilt people into giving them money." The third member of their group, a man with thick-rimmed glasses and a briefcase, laughed harshly. "I bet he never even served. Look at him. He can't even stand up straight. What kind of soldier would he have been?" Marcus felt the familiar burning in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times over the past year and a half. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was more like a deep, hollow ache that started in his stomach and spread outward until it reached his fingertips. He'd heard these comments before from different people in different places, but they never got easier to bear. The truth was, Marcus had served. He'd served with distinction, honor, and a courage that most people would never understand. But that part of his life felt like it belonged to someone else now. Someone who had existed before the nightmares, before the drinking, before the divorce, before the long spiral that had brought him to this street corner on this rainy Tuesday morning. He looked down at his hands, noting how they trembled slightly. Whether from the cold, from withdrawal, or from the memories that never seemed to fade, he couldn't say. The scars on his left hand were barely visible now, faded white lines that told a story he rarely shared with anyone. A woman with a small dog walked past and dropped $1 into the coffee cup at his feet. She didn't say anything, but she met his eyes for a brief moment and offered a small smile. It was the first human kindness he'd experienced all day, and he felt grateful despite everything else. The businessmen across the street were getting louder now, their mockery becoming more animated. Other pedestrians had begun to notice, some stopping to listen, others hurrying past with embarrassed expressions. Marcus wanted to disappear, to melt into the brick wall behind him, but he had nowhere else to go. This corner, under this narrow awning, was the closest thing to home he had. "Bet he's never even seen combat," the tall man was saying now, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Probably spent his time in some air-conditioned office, filing paperwork and eating donuts." The man with glasses nodded enthusiastically. "And now we're supposed to support him? I work 60 hours a week to pay my taxes, and this is where it goes. To fund his drinking problem?" Marcus closed his eyes and tried to block out their voices, but it was impossible. Their words seemed to echo in his head, mixing with other voices from other times. He remembered his ex-wife shouting at him to get help, to stop drinking, to stop waking up in cold sweats screaming at enemies that existed only in his dreams. He remembered his boss at the factory telling him not to come back after he'd missed too many days, unable to function after particularly bad nights. But underneath all those painful memories, buried deep but still present, were other voices. The voice of his commanding officer telling him he was the best soldier he'd ever seen. The voices of his teammates thanking him for saving their lives. The voice of a general pinning a medal to his chest and calling him a hero. Those voices seemed so distant now, like echoes from another lifetime, but they were real. They had happened. even if no one on this street corner would ever believe it. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the awning above his head with increasing intensity. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and tried to make himself smaller, hoping the businessmen would get bored and move on. But they seemed to be enjoying themselves too much to stop anytime soon. He thought about moving to a different corner, finding another place to spend the day. But he was tired, so deeply tired that the thought of walking even a few blocks felt overwhelming. So he stayed where he was, enduring their mockery like he'd endured everything else these past months. What the businessmen across the street didn't know, what none of the people hurrying past him knew, was that Marcus Riley had once been someone very different. Someone whose very presence on a battlefield could change the course of an entire operation. Someone whose name was spoken with respect and awe by soldiers who had served alongside him in places where death was a constant companion. But that was before the war had followed him home and taken up permanent residence in his mind. The lunch crowd had begun to gather despite the rain, and the three businessmen had attracted a small audience. What had started as casual mockery was evolving into something uglier, more public, and infinitely more humiliating for Marcus. The tall man with the gold watch seemed to be feeding off the attention, his voice growing louder and his gestures more dramatic with each passing minute. "You know what really gets me?" he announced to anyone within earshot. "These guys claim they fought for our freedom, but look at him. Does that look like someone who could fight for anything? He can't even fight for a decent meal or a shower." A few people in the growing crowd chuckled nervously. Others looked uncomfortable but didn't move away. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, studying his appearance, making their own judgments about whether he deserved their sympathy or their contempt. The rain had soaked through his jacket now, and he could feel the cold water running down his back. His cardboard sign had completely disintegrated, leaving only small pieces of soggy cardboard scattered around his feet. The dollar the kind woman had given him floated in his coffee cup, surrounded by rainwater. "I've seen this guy here before," said a woman in a business suit who had stopped to listen. "He's always got that same story. Homeless veteran. It's like they all use the same script." The man with thick glasses nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And have you noticed how they all claim to be combat veterans? Never anyone who admits they spent their service time cooking in a mess hall or fixing trucks. It's always the dramatic stuff that's supposed to make us feel guilty." Marcus gripped the strap of his backpack tighter, his knuckles white beneath the grime on his hands. Inside that backpack, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it dry, was a small metal box containing the only proof he had left of who he used to be. His discharge papers, a few faded photographs, and a medal that had once meant everything to him. But he'd learned long ago that showing those items to skeptics only made things worse. People assumed they were fake, stolen, or belonged to someone else. The shortest of the three businessmen had pulled out his phone and was pointing it in Marcus's direction. "I should post this on social media," he said with a laugh. "Show people what their tax dollars are really supporting. Look at this guy, he's probably high right now." "Brandon, don't," said a woman standing nearby, her voice uncomfortable. "That's not right." But Brandon was already taking photos, making a show of it for his friends. Why not? If he's going to sit there with his sob story asking for handouts, then he should be prepared for some public scrutiny. This is America. We have a right to know who we're being asked to support. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, a brittle thing that had been holding together through sheer force of will. He'd been photographed before by other people who wanted to mock or shame him. Each time he'd told himself it didn't matter, that these people didn't know him, that their opinions couldn't touch the truth of who he was. But today something was different. Today the pain felt sharper, more personal. He started to stand up, his joints protesting after sitting on the cold concrete for hours. The movement was slow and unsteady, and it only seemed to fuel the crowd's derision. "Oh, look," the tall man called out. "Now he's going to come over here and ask us for money directly. Or maybe he'll get aggressive. That's what these guys do when they get called out." But Marcus wasn't planning to cross the street. He was just trying to maintain what little dignity he had left, to stand up straight despite the pain in his back and the exhaustion that seemed to have settled into his bones. As he struggled to his feet, his jacket fell open slightly, revealing a small tattoo on his neck that had been hidden by his collar. Most people in the crowd didn't notice it. It was just a small dark mark that could have been anything. But one person saw it clearly, and the sight of it made him freeze in place. That person was Dr. James Chen, a psychiatrist who worked at the VA hospital across town. He had been walking to a lunch meeting when he'd heard the commotion and stopped to see what was happening. Now staring at the tattoo on Marcus's neck, his medical training and his work with veterans was telling him something that the mocking crowd couldn't possibly understand. The tattoo was small and simple, just 4 numbers that most people would assume were random. But Dr. Chen recognized them immediately. They weren't random at all. They were coordinates. And not just any coordinates, but the specific location of a forward operating base in Iraq that had been attacked in 2003. During the early days of the war, Dr. Chen had seen that tattoo before, on other veterans who had served at that base. It was something the survivors had done to honor their fallen comrades, a way of carrying their brothers with them forever. It wasn't the kind of detail that someone would fake, and it certainly wasn't something you could buy at a thrift store along with a military jacket. The doctor's mind was racing now, trying to remember the stories he'd heard about that particular base, about the attack that had taken place there, about the soldiers who had distinguished themselves during those dark hours. There had been one soldier in particular, he recalled, someone whose actions had become legendary among the troops who served in that region. But that couldn't be the same person standing across the street, could it? The hero from those stories was supposed to be someone larger than life, someone whose very presence commanded respect, not this broken man being mocked by a crowd of strangers. Dr. Chen began to move closer, pushing gently through the crowd that had formed around the 3 businessmen. He needed to get a better look, needed to confirm what his instincts were telling him. Because if he was right, if this homeless man was who he thought he might be, then the people laughing and taking photos had no idea who they were humiliating. "Excuse me," he said quietly, trying to get closer to where Marcus stood. But his voice was lost in the noise of the crowd, which had grown larger and more boisterous as the spectacle continued. The man with the gold watch was now addressing the crowd like a performer on a stage. "This is what's wrong with America today," he declared. "We're so afraid of being called heartless that we throw money at every sob story we hear. But when was the last time any of you actually verified whether these people are telling the truth?" Several people in the crowd nodded in agreement. The mob mentality was taking hold, and Marcus could feel the hostility radiating toward him like heat from a fire. He wanted to walk away, to disappear into the maze of downtown streets. But his legs felt unsteady and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. Dr. Chen pushed harder through the crowd, his sense of urgency growing stronger with each passing second. He needed to reach Marcus before this situation spiraled completely out of control. Dr. Chen finally managed to push through to the front of the crowd, his heart racing as he got his first clear view of Marcus's face. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. Beneath the beard, beneath the weathered skin and the hollow eyes, beneath the obvious signs of months spent on the streets, he could see the ghost of features he recognized from a photograph that had once hung in the hallway of the VA hospital. The photograph had been taken down years ago during a renovation, but Dr. Chen remembered it clearly. It had shown a young soldier in desert camouflage, his face serious but determined, standing beside what looked like a damaged helicopter. The caption beneath had read, "Staff Sergeant Marcus Riley, Medal of Honor recipient, Operation Iraqi Freedom." But that couldn't be right, could it? The man in that photograph had been a hero, someone whose story had been told and retold among the military community. The man standing across from him now was clearly broken, forgotten, reduced to begging for spare change on a street corner. Dr. Chen stepped forward, ignoring the confused looks from the businessmen who had been expecting support for their mockery, not interruption. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "I'm Dr. Chen from the VA hospital. Could I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus looked up sharply, his eyes focusing on the doctor with a mixture of surprise and wariness. Years of living on the streets had taught him to be suspicious of anyone who claimed to want to help, especially official-looking people with badges or credentials. "I don't need a doctor," Marcus said quietly, his voice hoarse from disuse and the cold rain. "I'm fine." The tall businessman with the gold watch laughed loudly. "Oh, this is perfect. Now we've got a government employee coming to rescue our fake veteran. How much is this little intervention going to cost the taxpayers?" But Dr. Chen wasn't paying attention to the businessman anymore. His focus was entirely on Marcus, and specifically on the details that were becoming clearer as he studied the man's appearance. The way he stood, despite his obvious exhaustion, still showed traces of military bearing. The tattoo on his neck that had first caught his attention was definitely what he'd thought it was, and now, looking more closely, he could see a scar running along Marcus's left temple that disappeared into his hairline. "That scar," Dr. Chen said quietly, stepping closer. "How did you get it?" Marcus's hand moved instinctively to touch the side of his head, his fingers tracing the raised line of tissue that marked where shrapnel had torn through his skin years ago. The question had caught him off guard, and for a moment his carefully maintained walls dropped slightly. "Helicopter crash," he said automatically, then immediately regretted saying anything at all. Dr. Chen felt his pulse quicken. "When? Where?" The businessman named Brandon was getting impatient with this interruption to his entertainment. "Hey, Doc, are you seriously buying into this guy's story? He's probably got a whole collection of fake scars and made-up war wounds." But Dr. Chen held up a hand to silence him, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "The tattoo on your neck," he said. "Those coordinates. I recognize them. Forward Operating Base Falcon, isn't it?" The effect of those words on Marcus was immediate and dramatic. His entire body went rigid, his eyes widening as if he'd been struck. Those coordinates weren't common knowledge. They weren't something you could look up on the internet or find in a book. They were known only to the people who had been there, who had lived through what happened at that base during those terrible 48 hours in March of 2003. "How do you know about Falcon?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. The crowd had gone quiet now, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what it was. The three businessmen looked confused and slightly annoyed that their entertainment was being interrupted by what seemed like serious conversation. Dr. Chen moved even closer, lowering his voice so that only Marcus could hear him. "I know about Falcon because I've treated dozens of veterans who served there. I know about the attack, about the casualties, about what happened to Bravo Company when their position was overrun." Marcus's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Hearing those words, those names, was like having a door torn open that he'd spent years trying to keep locked. The memories came flooding back unbidden. The sound of incoming mortars, the screams of wounded soldiers, the smell of smoke and blood and cordite that had filled the air for what seemed like an eternity. "You're him, aren't you?" Dr. Chen said softly. "You're Ghost." The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Ghost. It had been his call sign, earned during those dark hours when he'd seemed to appear and disappear like a phantom, moving through enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, always one step ahead of death. His teammates had called him Ghost because bullets seemed to pass right through him, because he could be everywhere and nowhere at once when his brothers needed him most. But no one had called him by that name in years. No one who was still alive anyway. The businessman with the gold watch had been watching this exchange with growing irritation. "What's all this nonsense about ghosts? Are you people seriously buying into this guy's delusions? Next, he'll be telling us he single-handedly won the war." Dr. Chen turned toward the businessman, his professional demeanor suddenly replaced by something much harder and more protective. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back and stop interfering with this conversation." "Oh, now I'm interfering?" The businessman laughed. "I'm just trying to save you from being conned by a professional beggar. This guy's playing you, Doc." He probably looked up some military terms online and memorized a few details to make his story more convincing. But Dr. Chen wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about the stories he'd heard from other veterans, stories that had seemed almost too incredible to believe, stories about a soldier who had saved 17 lives in a single night, who had held off an entire enemy platoon while his unit evacuated casualties, who had earned the Medal of Honor for actions that had gone far beyond the call of duty. And now that soldier was standing in front of him, homeless and broken, being mocked by people who had no idea they were in the presence of one of the most decorated heroes of the Iraq War. "Marcus," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Marcus Riley, Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, Medal of Honor, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with Valor device." Each word hit Marcus like a hammer blow, bringing back memories he'd been trying to forget for years, memories of ceremony and honor, of respect and recognition, of a time when his name had meant something important to the people who mattered. The crowd had gone completely silent now, sensing that something momentous was happening even if they didn't understand what it was. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, before Dr. Chen turned to face the crowd, his expression grave and purposeful. The businessman with the gold watch started to speak again, but the doctor's raised hand and stern look stopped him mid-sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Chen said, his voice carrying clearly across the street, despite the falling rain, "I need to tell you something about the man you've been watching. Something that I think will change your perspective considerably." Marcus tried to step backward, to retreat into the shadows, but there was nowhere to go. The brick wall behind him seemed to press against his shoulders, trapping him in this moment he'd been dreading for months. He didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want his story told. He just wanted to disappear. "Please," he whispered to Dr. Chen. "Don't." But the doctor's attention was focused on the crowd now, particularly on the three businessmen who had started this entire spectacle. "The man you've been mocking, the man you've been taking pictures of and calling a fraud, is Staff Sergeant Marcus Riley. And if that name doesn't mean anything to you, then let me tell you why it should." The businessman named Brandon lowered his phone, suddenly looking less confident than he had moments before. "Look, Doc, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but this isn't a game," Dr. Chen interrupted sharply. "This is about a man who served his country with such distinction that he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration that can be bestowed upon a member of the United States Armed Forces." A murmur went through the crowd. Several people began to look uncomfortable, shifting their weight and glancing at each other with uncertain expressions. The Medal of Honor wasn't something people joked about. Even civilians who knew little about the military understood that it was reserved for acts of extraordinary heroism. The tall businessman with the gold watch shook his head dismissively. "Come on. You expect us to believe that this homeless guy is some kind of war hero? Look at him. Does he look like Medal of Honor material to you?" Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "What exactly do you think a Medal of Honor recipient is supposed to look like? Do you think heroism provides some kind of magical protection against PTSD? Against addiction? Against homelessness? Do you think courage in combat automatically translates to an easy civilian life?" The crowd was growing larger now, with more people stopping to listen to this unexpected drama playing out on the street corner. Someone in the back called out, "What did he do? What did he do to earn the medal?" Dr. Chen looked back at Marcus, who was now standing with his arms wrapped around himself, his face pale and his breathing rapid. "Should I tell them?" the doctor asked quietly. Marcus closed his eyes and shook his head slightly. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said. "That was someone else. That was a long time ago." "It does matter," Dr. Chen said firmly. "It matters because these people need to understand what they've been doing. They need to know who you are." He turned back to the crowd, his voice becoming stronger and more commanding. "On March 15, 2003, Forward Operating Base Falcon came under attack by a coordinated enemy force. The base was overrun, communications were cut, and casualties were mounting. Staff Sergeant Riley's unit was pinned down in a building that was taking heavy fire from multiple directions. The rain continued to fall, but nobody in the crowd seemed to notice anymore. Every eye was focused on Dr. Chen as he continued his account. When the building took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade, the upper floor collapsed, trapping several wounded soldiers in the rubble. The rest of the unit was ordered to fall back to a more defensible position, but Staff Sergeant Riley refused to leave his trapped comrades behind. Marcus felt his legs growing weak. He leaned back against the wall, trying to block out the doctor's words, but they seemed to echo in his head like artillery fire. He could smell the smoke again, could hear the screams of wounded men calling for help, could feel the weight of the gear on his back as he crawled through the rubble searching for survivors. For the next 6 hours, Dr. Chen continued, Staff Sergeant Riley made repeated trips into the collapsed building under heavy enemy fire. He pulled 17 soldiers to safety, treating their wounds with whatever medical supplies he could find, carrying those who couldn't walk on his back across open ground while machine gun bullets and mortar rounds exploded around him. The businessman with thick glasses had gone very quiet. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of unease as he began to understand the magnitude of what he'd been part of. When the enemy force mounted a final assault on their position, Dr. Chen said, his voice growing more intense, Staff Sergeant Riley single-handedly held them off while his wounded comrades were evacuated to safety. He used an enemy machine gun captured from fallen insurgents, and when that ran out of ammunition, he used his sidearm. When that was empty, he threw grenades. When he ran out of grenades, he fixed his bayonet and prepared to make a final stand. A woman in the crowd gasped audibly. Several people had pulled out their phones, but instead of taking mocking photos, they were searching the internet for information about the story they were hearing. The relief force arrived just as the enemy was about to overrun his position. Dr. Chen continued. They found Staff Sergeant Riley wounded, exhausted, and unconscious from blood loss, but still alive. Every single one of the 17 soldiers he had rescued survived their injuries and made it home to their families. The crowd was completely silent now except for the sound of rain hitting umbrellas and the distant noise of traffic. Even the businessman with the gold watch seemed to have lost his voice. The Army investigators said it was the most extraordinary display of courage and selflessness they had ever documented, Dr. Chen said. Staff Sergeant Riley was credited with saving 17 lives at the cost of nearly losing his own. The Medal of Honor citation called his actions conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Someone in the crowd started to clap, slowly and uncertainly at first, then with growing conviction. Others joined in, and soon the entire crowd was applauding. But Marcus didn't hear it. He was lost in the memories that Dr. Chen's words had unleashed, reliving moments he'd spent years trying to forget. The businessman named Brandon had quietly put his phone away and was staring at the ground, his face flushed with embarrassment and shame. His companions looked equally uncomfortable, suddenly realizing that their afternoon entertainment had turned into something much more serious and personally damaging. Dr. Chen walked across the street toward Marcus, leaving the crowd behind. "You saved 17 lives," he said quietly. 17 families got their sons and fathers and brothers back because of what you did. That doesn't just disappear because you're going through a hard time now. Marcus looked up at him, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I couldn't save them all. 3 men died that day, 3 good men who should have made it home. And 14 more would have died if you hadn't been there," Dr. Chen replied. "You can't save everyone, Marcus. But you saved who you could, and that matters." Dr. Chen could see that Marcus was struggling to stay present, his eyes darting between the crowd and some invisible horizon that only he could see. The doctor recognized the signs immediately. The rapid breathing, the defensive posture, the way Marcus seemed to be listening to sounds that no one else could hear. He was having a flashback, triggered by the retelling of events he'd spent years trying to suppress. "Marcus," Dr. Chen said softly, positioning himself between the veteran and the still-growing crowd. "You're safe. You're in downtown Portland, Oregon. It's Tuesday, October 24th. The war is over. You're safe." The grounding technique seemed to help slightly. Marcus blinked hard several times and took a shuddering breath. But his hands continued to shake as he gripped the straps of his backpack. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, with more stopping every minute as word spread about what was happening. But the mood had changed completely from the mockery and derision of earlier. People were speaking in hushed, respectful tones, and several individuals had approached the edge of the group with obvious intentions of helping. An elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap pushed through the crowd and stopped directly in front of the 3 businessmen who had started the entire incident. His face was stern, his posture military straight despite his age. "You 3 ought to be ashamed of yourselves," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen his own share of combat. "That man over there has done more for this country in a single day than you'll probably do in your entire lives, and you've been treating him like garbage." The businessman with the gold watch tried to respond, but his voice came out as a weak stammer. We didn't know." "How could we have known?" "You didn't know because you didn't bother to find out," the elderly veteran replied sharply. "You saw a homeless man and immediately assumed he was worthless. Well, let me tell you something about worthless. Worthless is standing here mocking a man who risked his life for strangers while you've probably never risked anything more dangerous than a paper cut." Meanwhile, Dr. Chen was trying to piece together how a Medal of Honor recipient had ended up living on the streets. He knew from his work at the VA that the transition from military to civilian life could be devastating for combat veterans, but Marcus's fall seemed particularly steep and tragic. "When did you come home?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Marcus was still fighting to stay grounded in the present moment. 2004, he said quietly. "Got out in May. They said I'd done enough. They said I'd earned my rest." What happened when you got back? The question seemed to open a floodgate that Marcus had been holding back for years. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if telling the story was both painful and necessary. They gave me a parade, he said, his voice bitter. Hometown hero, they called me. Newspapers wanted interviews. TV stations wanted to do stories. Everyone wanted to shake hands with the Medal of Honor guy. He paused, his breathing still uneven. But nobody wanted to listen when I tried to tell them what it was really like over there. Nobody wanted to hear about the nightmares or the sounds I couldn't get out of my head. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. He'd heard similar stories from dozens of other veterans. The disconnect between the public's perception of heroism and the private reality of trauma. I tried to fit in, Marcus continued. Got a job at a factory. Married my high school girlfriend. Bought a house with a white picket fence just like in the movies. But I couldn't sleep. Every night I'd wake up screaming, thinking I was back in that building, hearing my guys calling for help. A woman in the crowd had started crying quietly as she listened to his story. Others were nodding with understanding, recognizing echoes of their own family members' struggles with PTSD. The drinking started small, Marcus said. Just a beer or two to help me sleep. But the nightmares kept getting worse. I'd see the faces of the men who didn't make it home. I'd hear their voices calling my name, asking why I couldn't save them too. The businessman named Brandon had been listening to every word, his earlier mockery replaced by obvious guilt and distress. He kept opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again, clearly struggling with how to respond to what he was hearing. My wife tried to help, Marcus continued, his voice growing even quieter. She begged me to get counseling, to go to the VA, to get treatment. But I was too proud, too stubborn. I thought I could handle it on my own. I thought asking for help would make me weak, would make me less of a soldier. Dr. Chen winced internally. He'd seen this pattern countless times. Veterans who had been trained to be self-reliant and strong, who viewed seeking help as a sign of failure rather than a necessary step toward healing. The drinking got worse. I started missing work, started having panic attacks in crowded places, started seeing enemies everywhere, jumping at every loud noise, every unexpected movement. Marcus looked up at the crowd surrounding him, his eyes focusing on their faces for the first time since Dr. Chen had started telling his story. My wife left me in 2007, said she couldn't watch me destroy myself anymore, said she'd tried everything she could think of, but I had to want to get better and I didn't. She was right. His voice cracked slightly. She deserved better than what I'd become. The elderly veteran in the baseball cap had tears in his eyes now. He'd clearly seen similar stories play out among his own generation of warriors, men who had come home from Vietnam to face their own struggles with an unsympathetic society. Lost the house 6 months later, Marcus continued. Lost the job. Lost everything except the bottle and the nightmares. Spent a few years bouncing between cheap motels and friends' couches. But eventually I wore out my welcome everywhere. Been on the streets for the last year and a half. The crowd was completely silent now, absorbing the tragedy of what they were hearing. This wasn't just a story about homelessness or addiction. It was a story about a hero who had been failed by the very society he had risked his life to protect. The worst part, Marcus said, his voice barely audible, is that people look at me now and they see everything I've lost, everything I've failed at. But they don't see the part that still matters. They don't see that I'd do it all again tomorrow if my country needed me to. They don't see that I still wake up every morning grateful that 17 families got their sons back, even if I couldn't save them all. Dr. Chen felt his throat tighten with emotion. In his years of working with veterans, he'd learned that the greatest tragedy wasn't just what they'd lost, but how society had forgotten to value what they'd given. The transformation in the crowd was immediate and profound. What had begun as a cruel spectacle had become something entirely different, a moment of collective shame, recognition, and ultimately, redemption. People who had been taking photos and laughing just an hour earlier were now wiping tears from their eyes and looking at Marcus with expressions of deep respect and regret. The businessman with the gold watch, who had been the ringleader of the mockery, stepped forward hesitantly. His expensive suit was now soaked with rain, and his perfectly styled hair hung limp around his face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir," he said, addressing Marcus directly for the first time, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to apologize for what we did. What I did? Marcus looked at him for a long moment, studying the man's face. There was genuine remorse there now, real shame and horror at what he had participated in. But Marcus had been disappointed by people's promises and apologies before. You don't need to apologize to me, Marcus said quietly. You need to apologize to yourself. You need to figure out why you thought it was okay to treat another human being like that, regardless of who they were or what they'd done. The businessman named Brandon had pulled out his phone again, but this time he wasn't taking pictures. Instead, he was deleting the photos and videos he'd recorded earlier, his hands shaking as he worked. I posted some of this on social media, he said, his voice thick with shame. I need to take it down. I need to explain what really happened. The third businessman, the one with thick glasses, had been standing silently throughout Marcus's story. Now he stepped forward and did something unexpected. He removed his expensive overcoat and held it out toward Marcus. Please, he said. You're soaked through. Take this. Marcus stared at the offered coat for a moment, then shook his head. I don't need your charity. It's not charity, the man replied. It's respect. It's the least I can do after what we put you through. Dr. Chen could see that the situation was reaching a critical point. Marcus was overwhelmed, the crowd was emotionally charged, and there was a real risk that the veteran might simply walk away and disappear back into the anonymity of the streets. He needed to take control of the situation before that happened. Marcus, he said, stepping closer, I want to offer you something. Not charity, not pity, but an opportunity. I work at the VA hospital, and we have programs specifically designed to help veterans who are struggling with homelessness and PTSD. Real programs, with real support, run by people who understand what you've been through. Marcus's immediate instinct was to refuse, just as he'd refused similar offers before. But something about this moment, about being recognized for who he really was rather than dismissed for what he'd become, made him hesitate. I've tried the VA before, he said. It didn't work out. That was then, Dr. Chen replied. Things have changed. We have new programs, new approaches, and more importantly, you're in a different place now. You're ready to accept help, or you wouldn't still be alive. The elderly veteran with the baseball cap had been listening to this exchange with growing determination. Now he stepped forward and addressed the crowd directly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the street, we've all witnessed something today that none of us will ever forget. We've seen how easy it is to judge someone without knowing their story, and we've learned about a hero who was hiding in plain sight. The crowd murmured agreement, many people nodding as they listened to the older man's words. But recognition isn't enough, he continued. This man served our country with distinction, and our country failed him when he came home. We can't change that, but we can do something about it right now. Today. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill, but instead of offering it to Marcus directly, he handed it to Dr. Chen. Doctor, I want this to go toward whatever program you think will help Staff Sergeant Riley the most, not as charity but as payment of a debt that we as a society owe to him. The effect was immediate. People throughout the crowd began reaching for their wallets and purses, but Dr. Chen quickly held up his hand to stop them. That's very generous, he said. But what Marcus needs right now isn't money. What he needs is support, understanding, and proper medical care. What he needs is for people to remember that homelessness doesn't erase service, and addiction doesn't cancel out heroism. A young woman near the front of the crowd spoke up. What can we do? How can we help? Dr. Chen looked at Marcus, who was still leaning against the brick wall, looking overwhelmed by the attention and the emotional intensity of the moment. The best thing you can do is remember this moment. Remember that every homeless person you see has a story, has value, has dignity. Remember that judgment without understanding is always wrong. The businessman with the gold watch had been standing quietly throughout this exchange, but now he stepped forward again. Staff Sergeant Riley, he said, his voice stronger now. I want to offer you something. I'm the regional manager for a security company. We have contracts with several major corporations in the city. If you're interested, if you're ready, I'd like to offer you a job. Not because I feel guilty, though I do, but because someone with your experience and your character would be an asset to our company. Marcus looked at him with surprise. You don't know anything about my work history. You don't know if I'm reliable or if I can handle responsibility. I know you held off an enemy platoon single-handedly to save the lives of your fellow soldiers, the businessman replied. I know you've survived 18 months on the streets without giving up hope. I know you carried 17 wounded men to safety under fire. That tells me everything I need to know about your character and your reliability. Dr. Chen could see that Marcus was struggling to process everything that was happening. The veteran's world had been turned upside down in the space of an hour, going from being mocked and humiliated to being recognized and offered help from multiple directions. Marcus, the doctor said gently, you don't have to decide anything right now. But I want you to know that there are people who care about what happens to you. There are resources available to help you rebuild your life. And most importantly, there are people who understand that you're not defined by your worst moments, but by your best ones. The crowd had begun to disperse slowly, but many people lingered, clearly reluctant to leave this extraordinary moment behind. Several individuals approached Dr. Chen to ask about volunteer opportunities at the VA, or ways they could support homeless veterans in their community. The rain had finally stopped, and weak sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Marcus looked up at the sky, then back at the small group of people who remained around him, Dr. Chen, the elderly veteran, the three businessmen who had been transformed from tormentors to advocates. Ghost of the Gulf, he said quietly, testing the words as if he were trying them on after years of not wearing them. I haven't heard that name in a long time. Maybe it's time you did, Dr. Chen replied. Maybe it's time to remember that the man who earned that name is still inside you, still worth fighting for. Marcus nodded slowly, and for the first time in months, there was something in his eyes that looked like hope.